carrier does need to worry about their CSA. A driver who's an owner op who is using his own DOT authorization, he basically is acting as a carrier in this situation in reference to an inspection. So if he's running under his own DOT, gets pulled into a weigh station, gets a inspection with a long list of violations, he needs to worry about those both as a driver and a carrier. The CSA record applies to carriers. All violations from all inspections given to all drivers under that carrier's DOT go on that central record for them.
Well, our topic here is inspection violations. What are some of the common violations that you're seeing with trucking clients right now in terms of those things that come up during inspections?
Sure. So, Mark, the common violations that we typically see are either driver behavior or um, related to vehicle maintenance. And the reason for that is that commonly either you're going to have a roadside stop with an inspection, and that's based on officer observation of a driver in some kind of violation, or you're going to have it at a weigh scale. And the officer sees something wrong with the truck, some sort of vehicle maintenance violation. That can also happen for roadside stops. So he drives by the officer sees he has a tail light out, pulls him over. Or he drives by the officer and he's going 10 over. The officer pulls him over, inspection.
Okay. Now, there are different places that you can face these inspections. I know, for example, the scales are a place where those very frequently take place. But what are some other places where these typically take place?
Generally, you're going to see it on major highways and state highways. That's because usually the officers who are going to stop and actually give drivers an inspection, a DOT inspection, are going to be officers who have that training. That's usually state troopers, any police officers that work for a state organization. Usually, drivers are not going to encounter this in short haul situations where they're in the city, or even if they're going into a town and they get pulled over possibly by a city cop or even necessarily a sheriff deputy. That's a little less common that they would face an inspection in that situation.
Okay. Um, a lot of people get confused in terms of violations from an inspection versus a ticket. Can you explain in kind of layman's terms what the difference between those two things is?
Absolutely. So violations on a ticket go to your driver's license record. They go through courts, they involve your DMV, and violations on an inspection go to your FMCSA record. They affect carriers and they affect drivers at the federal level. Two different ways of recording driver behavior and kind of two opposite ends of a driver's record.
Now, let's talk about the record because in previous conversations, you pointed out that you actually have more than one record. You've got
Mhm.
the MVR. If you're your own carrier, you've got CSA, you've got PSP. Um, CSA is the one that affects you only if you're a motor carrier. Um, Explain, if you would, what some of the violations you need to be concerned about there are and how they affect you if they go on your CSA.
Okay. So a carrier does need to worry about their CSA. A driver who's an owner op who is using his own DOT authorization, he basically is acting as a carrier in this situation in reference to an inspection. So if he's running under his own DOT, gets pulled into a weigh station, gets a inspection with a long list of violations, he needs to worry about those both as a driver and a carrier. The CSA record applies to carriers. All violations from all inspections given to all drivers under that carrier's DOT go on that central record for them. For a driver, all you have to worry about is your PSP. It's the little slice of that whole record that only applies to you and inspections you got.
Now, talk a little bit, if you would, about what the possible consequences are if you have too many CSA points from a legal perspective, for example, because there's also a business perspective. But from the legal side, what are the possible consequences there?
Sure. So, first of all, let me be clear. Drivers actually do not get points on their version of this federal score. That's a common misconception. A lot of times, drivers will get pressure from their safety team for the carrier that they're running for. You're given too many points. You've got too many points. Carriers are either talking about internal scoring that they are doing for their drivers, or they're talking about their own points. Carriers get these points even though the drivers get the same violations on their record on their PSP. Um, the PSP doesn't have a scoring system. So carriers do get these CSA points and they build up over time. As you said, there's sort of a marketplace ecosystem around these points and the score. But for legal purposes, basically what can happen if you get too far into the red as a carrier, you'll start to get warnings from the federal DOT. And usually it'll come first in the form of a notice saying, hey, we see that your score is high in these areas. You really need to change your behavior, or there's going to be some consequences. It literally comes as a letter in the mail from the FNCSA warning you of that. After that, there's usually a warning, hey, if you don't change your behavior, you may be audited. And then that audit does come if the score remains really deeply bad with a lot of points. It's hard to say in short exactly where those lines are. It's very gray in that it completely depends on the types of violations that you're getting, how frequently you're getting them, and how large you are as a carrier. All those things can factor in.
Okay. I know this isn't your specialty, but there is that business perspective. For example, we've heard of carriers that have trouble finding loads if their CSA score crosses a certain benchmark. Have you heard from clients about that?
Yes. So carriers do have that issue, especially carriers who are small carriers, maybe owner ops who are associated with larger shippers. We hear a lot of guys complain about losing their business partnership with Amazon or other large vendors or shippers because Amazon or these other large companies have really strict um, parameters for what the score can be and what it can't be. So it's really easy for smaller carriers, people who are running one truck, five trucks, to very quickly get overloaded by these violations just because of their size relative to the violations that they're getting. All that to say that it can affect how you're able to get loads and navigate the market. And I would say that the the easiest way to offset that, because it's really tricky to navigate this kind of thing and find out like where exactly is the deep water. How do I know when I'm there before I get there? The easiest way to try to mitigate some of this stuff and stay safe, if you're a small carrier or an owner op, is to watch your own score like a hawk, watch your trucks like a hawk. And if you can avoid getting these violations or as many of them as possible in the first place by making sure that the driver's behavior is all on the up and up and the log books, like the ELD devices that you're using, are not on the fritz, and that everything with the truck is exactly with the way that it should be. I know that's a really, really hard thing to do and a high bar to set. But if you're setting that bar for yourself, then you won't be underneath it when when someone else comes to say, hey, you haven't measured up. So it's really a matter of policing yourself so that you can stay out of that trouble.
Now, we mentioned a few moments ago that there is another type of record, the MVR, the motor vehicle record. Is there anything from inspections that interacts with that record?
Yes, a kind of common um, saying or common wisdom in trucking, especially between safety managers and truckers, is if you get an inspection, ask the officer to give you a ticket as well. That's kind of a weird thing to say, but the reason that it's said is if a ticket, a traffic ticket, matches a violation on the inspection, then if you go and you happen to win in a traffic case in court, somehow reducing that ticket or dismissing it, then you can take the court's judgment bring it back to the FMCSA and say, hey, a judge signed off on this change. You need to make this change on my CSA record or my driver PSP. That's a pretty common cycle of getting things off of your federal record. However, there's two camps. One is what I just explained. Hey, ask the officer to get a ticket. And the other, which I subscribe to, and I have to say this, never ask the officer to give you a ticket. Never
I
like
was
push
waiting
the
for that.
officer. Yes, please do not do that. Even if it might affect your CSA, even if it might affect your PSP, that is a lower consequence to pay than the extreme danger for a driver and also kind of in a secondary way for a carrier of getting yourself into a court situation that you cannot win. And now you have something on two records instead of one. A lot of drivers will say, oh, if I'd only pushed him, if I'd only asked him to give me a ticket and not let me off with a warning, then I could have fought this. And now I'm out of a job. Something that I think is really, really important to bring to bear. The CSA record for carriers lasts for 2 years and then it disappears. For drivers, that's 3 years. Now, that may seem like a long time, but on a driver's MVR, those violations stay forever. You can technically pull a driver's entire driving history off of their driver's license record, any ticket that they have ever gotten, and you could use that as a way to hike their insurance rates or to deny them a job. So drivers just kind of need to be aware of the perspective as they're looking to protect their records, carriers as they're looking to protect their score, that a small hit now that may affect you for a couple of years is way easier to swallow than something that may stick with you for an entire career.
I know that with CSA, you can do a data queue challenge, and you kind of walked through part of that procedure there when you talked about, if you challenge a ticket, you can go through data queue with that. Is there a similar system for information on your MVR?
There is. You can go and pull a copy of your MVR. Now, there are technically other kind of smaller forms of your record that sort of sit between these two large pillars. A common record type is the DAC, which is actually held by a company called Higher Right. It's not a real like government agency that's holding it, but it's sort of a combination of a couple of different things with other info added in. But if you want to go and find out what your MVR says about you, you can always go to your state DMV and say, hey, either online or just by walking into one of their offices, say, hey, can I have a copy of my record, please?
Okay. Is there anything else on this topic that you want to add or you think people need to be aware of?
Sure. So I wanted to say that if you get an inspection and you see that there's violations on it, it's really important to know what those are and what they might do to you. So I would strongly recommend doing a little bit of research or asking an expert. If you trust your carrier, then go to talk to a safety person or your safety team. At any rate, if you are running for a carrier, you do have to turn that inspection into them. That's kind of required. But there's a lot of nuance with these violations. Some of them seem dramatic, but they aren't really. Some of them seem really mundane, but they can have a really big impact. And so it's always good to know exactly what you're up against. And if you have some way of making this data queue challenge in order to change something, even if a ticket's not associated with your inspection, there are other ways. So it's always good to know what you're up against so that you know what you can do in the future.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the information.
You're welcome.